Greetings to all the viewers. I welcome you all to Hansraj e-Samvaad. My name is Piyush Chaudhary, Assistant Professor at the Department of English at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. I welcome you all to this ongoing lecture series on GE, Individual and Society, a paper which is offered at the Department of English across the various colleges of the University of Delhi. In the previous 5 lectures, I have discussed firstly the introduction to the paper. I have delved into the various ideas which surround this paper and the construction of this paper and why this paper is actually important. Then we discussed the very first topic, and that was Siegfried Sassoon's Return from the Somme. Then we also studied Wilfred Owen's poem Dulce et Decorum Est, and then we studied Conscientious Objector by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Then I also discussed Bertolt Brecht's very popular The German War Primer poem General, Your Tank, which was a short poem, just 3 stanzas. Let us now come to the 5th topic of our syllabus, and that is a very witty poem written by Henry Reed. I said that it's a very witty poem because the way that this poem is constructed, it shows a brilliant display of wit and wordplay, and how the poet Henry Reed actually uses wit and wordplay to come up with a very, very ingenious poem where he describes the horrors of war and the violence of war, and he juxtaposes it with the felicity of nature, with the beauty of nature, and with the peace and the tranquility that nature actually provides us with. On this note, let me go forward now, and stanza by stanza we'll be reading this poem by Henry Reed. So as I firstly mentioned, this poem basically shows, and it also juxtaposes 2 different views, right? So the violence of the weapons, it describes, basically this poem describes an instructor in the army. He's an army man and he is an instructor, and he's instructing the newly recruited members, the newly recruited young boys who have recently been recruited to the army, and a lesson is going on. Basically it's one of those earliest probation lessons that he is giving to his subordinates, the new recruits to the army, and he's describing the various parts of the rifle. So that is what the title of the poem is. It's naming of parts. So the name of the various parts of a rifle is being described here, and we'll see how the poet Henry Reed, he juxtaposes it with the objects of nature. So basically the poem shows the juxtaposition of the violence of weapons, the violence of war, and he compares it with, and he juxtaposes it with what? With the felicity and the tenderness of nature, with the beauty of nature. So this is the larger idea, and this is how the entire poem is constructed, right? So let us go now to the very first stanza, and right from the very first stanza you can realize that it's a brilliantly constructed poem, and a witty wordplay and contrasting images are being used to describe 2 highly opposing ideas of war and of love and peace, right? So let us read the very first stanza, and I'm going to read the stanza as you can see on the screen now. Today we have naming of parts. Yesterday we had the daily cleaning, and tomorrow morning we shall have what to do after firing. But today we have the naming of parts. So you see how in the first 4 lines itself, he's just describing that today the lesson will be on the naming of parts, and yesterday we had the daily cleaning of how to clean the rifle. Today I'll be telling you, the instructor says that I'll be telling you the name of the various parts of a rifle. Look at the 4th line now. Japonica glistens like coral in all of the neighboring gardens, and today we have naming of parts. So you see the first 4 lines are describing the instructor who is speaking to his young recruits and telling them that the lesson will be on naming of parts, and right after the 4th line, the author, the Henry Reed, the author, describes a young boy who is looking outside at the gardens, and he can see the flowers of Japonica. Japonica, as we know, it's a beautiful looking reddish pinkish plant. It's a flower, and one can only think about how Henry Reed is contrasting these two images. So at one side you have the rifle, and on the other side you have the beautiful japonica flower, right? So this is what the idea is, the contrasting images, you know. So this is how Henry Reed is writing. So the poem opens with the instructor instructing the new army recruits about, you know, the various parts of the rifle, and one of the army recruits, he's sitting there in the league of the other, you know, young recruits, and he is not paying attention much to the instructor, but he is rather looking outside at the beautiful nature. Thereby Henry Reed is also suggesting that, you know, the young recruit, he is not violent by nature. In fact, you know, we become violent. These people are taught violence, you know, they are initiated into violence, and, you know, violence gets institutionalized within them. Rather, they are more interested in looking at the finer things in life, such as peace, love, beauty, nature, flowers, and nature in all its pristine glory, right? So the movement, or, you know, the action of this entire poem, you know, the first stanza itself sets the tone of all the other stanzas to follow, right? So the poem oscillates between the beauty of nature versus the horrors of war. This is where, you know, the whole poem will keep on revolving. The poem will keep on oscillating between these two ideas. As you can see on the screen, this is the lower swing swivel, and this is the upper swing swivel, whose use you will see when you are given your slings. And this is the piling swivel, which in your case you have not got. So you see, the instructor is telling them about the various parts. Swivel is basically a part of the rifle, and since the day is about the, you know, the lesson is on the naming of parts, so swivel is one part. So the instructor is just demonstrating, you know, the teacher is demonstrating the young recruits about the various parts. He says, the branches, and look at the next line, look at line number 10 now. Here comes the contrast, here comes the opposing idea. The branches hold in the gardens their silent, eloquent gestures, which in our case we have not got. So look at what the young recruit says. He says that the branches, and he thinks about that the branches hold in the gardens their silent, eloquent gestures. The branches are looking very beautiful. That means he's looking at the trees around, he's looking at the shrubs around, he's looking at the flowers, the plants around him. You know, in the perhaps one can imagine that this is an open field where, you know, the instruction is going on, right? And he is looking at the branches of the trees, and he says that there is an eloquent, there is a silent gesture, you know, amongst the trees, and the trees and the branches are looking very pretty, they are looking very good, and, you know, their eloquent and their silent gestures is something that we have not got. The young new army recruit is saying that he has not got the peace and the eloquent gestures and the beauty of the plants and the branches, right? Look at the next stanza, as you can see on the screen. This is the safety catch. So now a new part is being described. This is the safety catch, which is always released with an easy flick of the thumb. And please do not let me see anyone using his finger. You can do it quite easy if you have any strength in your thumb. The blossoms are fragile and motionless, never letting anyone see any of them using their finger, right? So once again, that juxtaposition of the violence of the rifle versus the beauty, of the blossoms, which are fragile. So you have the hard, you have the coarse, you have the cold rifle versus the warmth and the beauty and the softness, the tenderness and the beauty of the blossoms, which are blossoming, right? So instructor is telling everyone not to use his finger, but rather using the thumb, to unlock the safety catch of a rifle. Unless you don't press it, you cannot shoot. It's the safety catch, a very popular feature in amongst all the weapons that you have, be it a rifle or a pistol. So that is what is happening. So once again, a juxtaposition, as you can see, that is happening. Let's come to the next stanza, line number 19, and he says, and this you can see is the bolt. The purpose of the bolt is to open the breech. As you see, we can slide it rapidly backwards and forwards. We call this easing the spring. It's a very beautiful stanza. Okay, he says that we call this easing the spring, and rapidly backwards and forward the early bees are assaulting and fumbling the flowers. They call it easing the spring. So you see, spring is again a very important element, a very important part of a rifle, because it allows to repeatedly fire and at the enemy. So you have at one place you have the spring, which is describing, the spring of a gun. But on the other hand, you have the spring season, the beautiful spring season which comes after winter and which brings all the beauty of nature, forward after the brief slumber of the winter, right? So again, the horrors of war, the ghastly nature of war is being juxtaposed with the beauty of, the flowers and the various symbols related to nature and flowers. So the poet says that they call it easing the spring, and because rapidly back and forwards the early bees are assaulting and fumbling the flowers, right? So in the fourth stanza itself, you look at how the spring of the rifle is being juxtaposed with the back and forward that a bee does, while sucking the nectar out of the flowers, right? So while doing the pollination, while doing that particular process, which is very popular, it looks so beautiful, it looks so pretty. You see, so bees are attacking, they are attacking and assaulting, and the author says fumbling the flowers. So you see the beauty of a bee which is sucking the nectar and assaulting the nectar back and forth versus the assaulting and the spring, and which comes back and forth. So a brilliant wordplay, as I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture. This poem offers a brilliant wordplay, it's a very witty poem, and the wordplay that it uses, it brings out the characteristic, wit of the poem by Henry Reed, right? So let us go now to the next stanza. Look at line number 25. They call it easing the spring. It is perfectly easy if you have any strength in your thumb, like the bolt and the breech and the cocking piece and the point of balance, which in our case we have not got. And the almond blossom silent in all of the gardens, and the bees going backwards and forwards, for today we have naming of parts. So the poem ends on, the repeatedly the author, the poet, is mentioning the spring and, the brilliant wordplay of the spring in the rifle versus the spring in nature, the beautiful nature, spring being the most beautiful season. So by showing the contrast of the spring of the rifle with the spring of the nature, what the poet is essentially trying to do is, he is trying to show the contrast between death and life itself, right? So on one hand you have the spring of nature, on one hand you have the spring of nature, and on the other hand you have the spring of the rifle, and respectively on one hand you have life, you have the beauty of life, but at the other hand you have the death and you have the hatred of death. Hatred and death is being replicated, hatred and death is being shown, is being symbolized through these two symbols of the springs. Also you will notice that each stanza, there is a uniformity in each and every stanza. So the first 3 to 4 lines of each stanza, the first few lines of each stanza shows the horrors of war. It shows the drab way in which, the instructor is instructing everyone. It shows the violence of, war, the violence of the weapons in the first few lines. And then in each stanza, the ending few lines, the ending 2 or 3 lines, shows the tenderness of nature, the love of nature, and how nature actually, it's a beautiful thing to behold, right? So thereby, when the author is juxtaposing the horrors of war with the beauty of nature, what he is essentially doing is that he is essentially creating a very profound effect on the reader, So one can imagine this vivid, this profound effect, of an instructor who is, sternly ordering all his recruits, all his young probationers to follow his orders, and on the other hand, one of the army men, one of the new army recruits, one of the young boys, he's not listening, but he's rather looking at the beauty of nature, right? So the young army recruit, the student, is more interested in nature. He's more interested in looking at the finer details, the finer things in life, right? This is what Henry Reed is suggesting, and thereby he's suggesting that young minds are not corrupt by nature. Young minds are not evil by nature. Young minds are not, young men, young children are not evil by nature. Rather, it is the institutionalization of violence and war and hatred, and which instills in them a feeling of hatred towards an imagined enemy, right? So the young children are not corrupt. They are more interested, these young boys are more interested in looking at the japonica flowers, looking at the beautiful shrubs, looking at the blossoming flowers, and looking at spring, enjoying the beauty of spring, and they are beholding that beauty, right? But on the other hand, you have an instructor which is giving them strict instructions for war and for remembering the names of the parts of the rifle. So with this, I come to an end of this lecture. So the core idea is the brilliant juxtaposition of two highly opposing forces, and that is life and death. That is love and hatred at the same time, right? So this is the larger idea that Henry Reed is trying to tell us. That is pretty much the end of this lecture. So I will come to Saadat Hasan Manto's, Dog of Titwal, a very satiric story, which brilliantly infuses satire to show how humans are, mindless, how madness pervades them, and set in the backdrop of the partition of India, the story Dog of Titwal becomes much more relevant. I'll be taking up that, in the subsequent lectures. So I hope that the viewers enjoyed this lecture. I hope it gave them some food for thought, and I sincerely hope that it clarified your doubts related to this particular topic, naming of parts by Henry Reed. On this note, I would end the lecture. Thank you so much for being with me. I hope to see you soon in the next lecture on Saadat Hasan Manto's Dog of Titwal. Till then, keep reading, keep watching, keep sharing, keep commenting. I'll see you very soon. Thank you. Goodbye. Jai Hind.